Hi there! Today in my demonstration I'm going to be showing how to make a leather belt out of two laminated pieces of veg tan leather. Now you can do a belt entirely out of a solid piece of leather without requiring to laminate two pieces together, but I simply don't have any leather that is thick enough and no stores are open right now, so we're just going to use two pieces of 3.5 millimeter leather that is laminated together with some contact cement. Now when you're working with leather, it comes in a variety of different types. You can have leather that has dyes that have been impregnated into it. You can have a natural veg tan leather that is just natural in its finish, and then you can have different colors, different thicknesses used for different applications. Of course, you wouldn't use this for a belt. This is more for a decorative finish. But for today, we are just going to be focusing on using some veg tan leather, and that just describes the vegetable tannins that they use to cure the flesh, to turn it from a flesh material into a leather material that will not rot over time. And when you're working with leather, there's different tiers of quality of leather. Now, many of you have probably bought a belt in the past, and on the back it will say genuine leather made in Italy, or something like that. Now, genuine leather is the best advertising for crappy leather that they have out there right now. It's actually the worst part of the leather because it has the most amount of fleshy material on the bottom. It's just not a good quality material. If you look at the top here at full grain, which is like they also call saddleback leather, it has the tightest grain at the very top, so it's the strongest, most durable leather. It's used a lot for like horse saddles and equestrian type leather goods that need to be really strong because it's holding a person on a flailing animal. But the thing with the full grain is that it will have some defects in it. So here you can see that the actual burn mark in the hide is visible, and bug bites and small scars would also be visible. But that's just, you can work around that when you're working with a full grain material. Top grain is also still a very good quality material. As you can see, it kind of overlaps with the tight bundles of grain in the full grain, and then you get down to genuine leather, which is terrible leather. Generally it's a very, very thin layer of leather that they have laminated over top of another piece of leather, and then what they've done, like on this piece, is that they've painted the edge so you can't really tell that it's two different pieces of leather at the moment. So we're not going to be using any of that stuff. We're going to be using a top grain leather, veg tan. Now, since our leather isn't thick enough to use for a belt, that would be a pretty flimsy belt, we want to laminate these two pieces together. But before we do that, we need to talk about the hide. So when you purchase a hide from a leather store dealership, I got this at Lonsdale Leather, it will just be an odd shape. They've cut around different pieces here on the hide, and then this is the finished piece. Now, much like when you get rough lumber from the mill, this doesn't have a straight edge for you to work off of. And so the first thing you need to do is you need to establish a straight edge. So when you're cutting your material, use a nice cutting mat like this one here. Cutting knives will not go through this and damage the table beneath. And you'll want to use a steel ruler when you're doing your cutting to avoid the blade cutting into the actual ruler and damaging your finger or damaging the work that you're working on as well. So if we're going to pretend that this is our full piece of leather, because I don't have the room to put the full piece up there, you'll establish your starting edge. So you'll take your knife, and much like you do on cutting any other projects, you want to spread your fingers out nice and far across the work, and just like a light pressure for the first pass, then come back, and a second pass will bring you through. And the sharper you can keep your knife, the better. Other knives that are used for this kind of a process are like this one here, the Half Moon knife. It has a domed top, so when it's pushing through the leather, it's catching on its way down. So it's less likely to slip. When you're pulling on a knife like this, it could move. The Half Moon knife like that is a much better knife, but I'm too cheap to buy something like that, being a student and all that. So once you've cut your your face edge, I guess you should call it, you'll want to figure out how wide you want to make your belt. Like, what is the width that you're going to have this belt between the belt loops? Now, the determining factor of that is the distance between the actual buckle. Now, if you were to cut your piece of leather the exact distance between the buckle here, it would actually be a bit too big. So what you do is you measure between the 2 points here, and then you subtract 2 millimeters from the actual width overall, so one on each side. And the reason for this is if you were to cut a piece of leather the exact width of the buckle here, when you pull the leather back to make the belt, it actually bunches up at the corners there, simply because the material folding over on itself expands outward and makes it a little bit more, takes up a little more space. So what you actually want to do is you want to take off those 2 millimeters, and then your piece will sit real nice right in the middle like that, with a little bit of wiggle room back and forth is what you want to be looking for. So, since we are not working with a full piece of thick leather, we're laminating 2 pieces together. Once you've cut your strap to the correct width, either using a strap cutter, which is similar to a marking gauge, but it would have an X-Acto knife blade on it, and you could actually pull that along your leather that you're working along that straight edge, and it would cut a nice strap width. But again, I don't have that tool, so I just used an X-Acto knife. Pretend like this was a full piece of belt material, and it has been cut into our strips. To laminate these 2 pieces together, we use something called contact cement. And what you're doing with this is you are applying this to both sides of the leather material, and you're letting it dry. And once it's dried on both sides, when these 2 surfaces come in contact with each other, they will fuse together, and it'll be very, very hard to pull apart. Now, keeping that in consideration, as soon as you touch these to each other, they're not going to want to come apart. So you've got to be kind of careful when you're putting these down. You can use a piece of paper as a division between the 2, or a ruler, or something else. And what you'll want to do is you'll want to cover up the rest of the belt that you're not adhering yet, and you want to get the front here lined up, and you want to get the edges nice lined up, because if you attach them like this, your belt is going to be off center. So cover that up, get that nicely lined up there, and this is when this comes in handy to have this here. Since the rest of this is covered up, I can have this part here nice and bonded, so this won't come apart, and I can slowly start pulling this one away, and then I'm only adhering the part that I want to be working on. I can make sure that I get a nice aligned piece. So once we have our piece nicely aligned, you can take like a rolling pin or another utensil to kind of just work these 2 pieces in together. And now you have a piece that is similar to having 1 piece of leather. You can overcut your pieces. If they're a little bit misaligned, that's okay. You can come back here with your X-Acto knife and your ruler, and you can trim up that line so those line up a little bit better. Once you've done that, if you were to just leave these 2 sharp edges on your piece, it wouldn't be a nice finished product. It would be kind of like not rounding over or sanding any of the edges on your wood projects. So you'll want to take an edging tool like this, which has a little V in the middle of it. And what it does is it runs along the side of your piece of leather. See here, runs along the side of your piece of leather, and it just takes off a very small edge, kind of like a router bit. It just kind of takes off that sharp edge. So you want to run that along that edge, flip it over, and you're going to do that to the other side too. And what you're doing here is you start off with a sharp corner like this, and then your edging tool rounds that over. So once you have both those edges done, just like that, you now have a piece of leather that's gone from like this to rounded edges, which is much nicer. So now that you've rounded the edges off, there's a couple of different schools of thought of how to finish this up. Some people will come back here and they'll trim any excess with a knife because it makes a better finish. Much like using a card scraper to scrape the glue off makes a nicer finish. What this allows you to do is come back here and scrape off any of the contact cement that came out or any uneven surfaces to make a nice surface. That is nice, but you run the risk that you could accidentally cut into your belt by accident if you aren't comfortable with a knife. So what I recommend is you can get some sandpaper, starting with like an 80 grit sandpaper. And you can come in here, you can just sand that edge, and kind of sand it over on the side as well, to make it line up a little bit nicer and make it look a little bit more uniform. Then you work your way up from an 80 to maybe a 120 to and then all the way up to a 300. But now that we have sanded this, we have raised the fibers back up on this edge. So we're going to want to bring that back down. You can do this either with some water and a sponge, or in this case we have something, I don't have it right now, but it's called saddle soap, and it's just a glycerin material or a glycerin liquid that you can run along the top, and it helps kind of smooth all those grains back down. So to push that back down, you have something called a burnishing tool, and it has different radiuses running across its length. And what that does is it allows you to run it along the front here, along this edge. And what you're doing is you're just kind of buffing that and pushing all those fibers back down and rounding it over. So you start with the largest round over, like this, and you're just kind of running it back and forth. Take a look, and you're like, all right, that's looking good. And then you move down to the next smaller one down. And you repeat the same thing. Back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Like that. And then you can see here the difference between the two sides after just a few seconds of doing a little bit of burnishing. So this is the unfinished edge right here without any round over. And then this is the one that looks like a lot more professional product. So you can really bring up any of your leather working products by simply doing a burnished edge. It really makes them look professional. So once we have that edge done, we will have a full strap like this and burnished on both sides. And then what we're going to want to do is we want to attach the buckle. So to do that, we need to punch out a section of the belt to have the center of the belt come through, like that. Now, again, there are fancy leatherwork tools like an oblong punch that could punch this in one go, but I don't have that. So I just merely use a leather puncher, and I punch a hole there and a hole there, and then I take my knife and I just cut out this slot, and it does the same thing in just more steps. And then you'll thread your buckle through, fold it over, and make sure, I forgot to mention this, make sure that you leave enough material on this edge that you could fold this over, plus put in a belt loop. So you'll generally want to add in about an extra 2 inches when you're folding this over here. So take your measuring device, mark out your 2 inches, find your center, do your hole punches, make it an oblong punch, and then fold it over itself like that, so that a belt loop could fit in there and have enough space to be stitched closed. Now, when you're working with material that is this thick and you fold it over itself, it's too thick. So what you'll want to do is you'll want to take either a skiving knife, which works to take off the material somewhere. Oh, here we go. So it has a little blade on it like this, a little concave blade, and you can run that along your material, and it scrapes off some of the material, so you can take it down to a thinner dimension. So you'll want to do that all the way along this edge, because otherwise your belt will be very, very thick. Like cooking on television programs, I've already done that for you. So we have thinned out the material. You can see I've kind of taken it back down to one thickness across that width of the fold over that we did here. And then what I did is I simply took a punch, and there's a variety of different punches that they have. You have everything from a saddle stitch punch, which has punches that are set off at an angle, to straight punches, to single punches. There's a whole bunch of punches. And so simply what I did is I lined up where I wanted my belt buckle to be with my oblong punches here. And I put a thick piece of leather down as a base, or you could use a piece of wood as well. And I lined it up, and I took a hammer. And this here is a plastic hammer. Has quite a bit of heft to it, but it's not a metal hammer, because if you use a metal hammer on your leatherworking tools, you will cry, because leatherworking tools are expensive and you don't want to damage them. So do yourself a favor and spend the money on a plastic mallet like this. So you'll do your punches here, and then you will take a sewing needle, and this one's especially for leatherworking. It does not have a very sharp tip. It's kind of a rounded over tip because the holes are already made and it's simply being pushed through. And a little tip when you're working with sewing, whether it be with leatherworking or even regular sewing, is when you're pulling your thread through, if you were to simply stitch it with that, like that, the thread sticking out like that, it would just pull right through. Now some people tie a knot or do something like that, but there's a little trick. You pull your thread up to the top and you kind of pull the thread apart. You can actually push it, you push the thread through the needle, and you can do that a couple of times, and then you push it down to the end of the needle, and what you've done there is you've just threaded the needle over the thread itself, and now it's tied off to your needle, and it won't come undone. So now you can, starting on the back, you'd start on the back, and you would feed the needle through like this, and leave yourself, always leave extra. You can always cut off more. Thread is quite inexpensive, but it is very difficult to tie a knot when you only have about an inch of thread sticking out. So leave yourself a decent amount. And then you can stitch kind of whatever style, whatever makes you happy. You can do a double stitch. You can stitch it with 2 needles and do it at once. You can also, instead, if you don't want to use the needle, you can also use a rivet instead. We could punch this out with the hole punch here, and we could put a couple of, similar to the copper rivets that we used in the joining class. You could use a couple of these copper rivets and some washers and fix that in like that. Or you can do what I did here, and you can wrap the threading around the sides to finish that off. So we're now at the point where we have our buckle attached to our belt, and now is where we would add the belt loop in. Now I just made this one by taking a strip of leather, folding it over on itself, and then stitching it together. I don't actually want to use this one for this belt because this belt buckle came with a metal attachment instead. So here's when we would slide that onto the end, down to where we're attaching it, and then we simply do the same kind of stitch, or however way you want to fasten this, and you attach that on there. You could even add a little bit of rubber cement there, just to make sure that stays down nice and flat. And then we're almost done. The last thing we need to decide what to do is how we want to finish the end of the belt. Now, belts have many different styles that they can be done in. You can have a simple belt style like this one here, like a more traditional, more like modern kind of style belt. You can also have a belt that is in like the more Western style, edged off like this. And you can see in this one was done also laminating 2 pieces together. But I wanted to do a detail around the side, and so I did a stitch all the way along. That serves 2 purposes. It's going to be a longer lasting belt, simply because even though rubber cement is a quite good product, it can eventually over time wear and tear, pull apart. So what I'm going to do to mitigate that is I am going to put an end cap on my piece of laminated metal. And what that is going to do is I'm going to cut it off straight across like this. Now that I've got this really messy desk in front of me, I am going to square it up. So on these mats, they actually have lines running, like a grid on them, so I can line this up so I'm getting a nice square cut. And I am going to give that a cut. Nice even pressure, nice sharp knife, does a really nice job. And then I'll simply attach this piece on the end here. I'm going to have to get some pliers, I'm going to have to pull this one apart. But then I'd lock this on the end to finish off this belt, or I would cut it in one of those shapes to finish it off. And then at this point you can decide if you want to dye your belt, if you want it to be a certain color. There's a variety of different dyes that you can use to change the color of your belt. And I would just use, you can use you can buy these sponges on, it's like a paint brush and a sponge had a baby. And it has a sponge on the end, and you can take that and you can dye your belt afterwards. I'm actually going to leave this one in a natural veg tan finish like this. And the reason I'm going to do that is because over time, the oils of your hands and just like the wear and tear of this creates a beautiful patina on veg tan leather like this. And so after years of use, it's going to go from this very pinky color to like this much more natural, well not natural, but much nicer looking dark brown, just a natural patina that it develops over the years. Oh, one thing I forgot to mention was, of course, you can't put a belt on without the holes in your belt. So you'll take it, you can either take your most favorite belt, one that fits you really well, and you can line up the holes on that belt with your current belt and then mark them out, and then you have a custom belt made perfectly for you. Or you could hold it up to yourself currently, thread it through your belt, and then mark wherever those pieces are going to join, and then take your hole punch from there and punch those out. And that's it. That's how you at home, with some tools, can make yourself a really nice 100% not genuine leather, real leather, belt at home. Now these belts, if you were to buy these online from an artisan on Etsy or somebody else, they sell belts like this for $80 to $100. And for about 2 hours, 3 hours of your time, you can make yourself a belt that will last a really long time. So I hope that this was helpful for you, and I hope that you learned something new today, and yeah, stay safe.